Hello and welcome to the What the Finance podcast, where we talk to experts about all things finance. If you get value out of this episode, please subscribe so you don't miss out on any in the future. I hope you enjoy.
So, John, thank you so much for joining the What the Finance podcast today with me. My first question: how have you seen geopolitics change over the past 10 years? It sort of seems, in my opinion, that tensions have increased to levels we haven't seen for a while. What do you think about that?
Well, in many ways, Anthony, and first, before I answer the question, thank you for having me on your platform. It's terrific to join you and your audience here. It's a very important question that you ask because in many ways, the world has been utterly transformed by events of the last 10 to 12 years in ways that most of us have not really understood. And it's only really come into sort of clarity over the last several years. But of course, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact between 1989 and 1991, we entered a relatively peaceful, prosperous period, especially in the 1990s, what we, in retrospect, call the unipolar moment for the United States and, of course, for our Western allies and partners. The Soviet Union had become a backwater Russian country that was trying to determine whether its future would be more democratic with Europe or whether it would remain sort of outside of the European/Western mold. And China was still a relatively poor country that had been looking to become somewhat more prosperous under reforms that were introduced by Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s, but still relatively poor compared to other countries, certainly any country of its size. But I would say after 2001, the September 11th attacks certainly changed the way the United States dealt with the world, where we saw ourselves not just as atop this unipolar moment, but also one under severe threat of radical global jihadist political Islam. And we began a counterterrorism campaign, first in Afghanistan and then in Iraq, although Iraq was really more a matter of rooting out weapons of mass destruction that were never found. But those unfortunately became counterinsurgency movements that were layered upon what now seems to be a very misunderstood nation-building, democracy-promoting campaign in parts of the world where we didn't really understand the culture and the history of the peoples there. And in retrospect now, with the aftermath of the Afghanistan withdrawal, understanding that you really cannot layer sort of Western, American, European values, norms, and institutions on a somewhat primitive 7th century culture, a majority of whose adherents believe in Sharia law, as opposed to what we would consider to be the rule of law in the West, and ideally on a universal basis. But this is all a backdrop to what began to take place first in Moscow, I would posit, and then in Beijing, or maybe simultaneously, but they were manifested differently. Russia invaded Georgia in 2008, and that invasion was met with almost zero response from the United States and from our NATO allies. And it was against a backdrop of much noise in Tbilisi about Georgia becoming a member of the NATO alliance. And it was something that Vladimir Putin wanted to ensure would never take place. He already believed that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. So he was determined to at least shore up his sphere of influence, Russia's sphere of influence, and look to see to what extent he could test the West, and he succeeded. And I think that was a precursor to the invasion of Eastern Ukraine in 2014, along with the annexation of Crimea. And again, almost no serious Western response. I mean, sure, sanctions, lots of condemnatory statements, but first of all, Europe is too financially engaged with Russia, with Moscow, and also very much dependent on Russia for energy supplies. A condition which Germany has recently doubled. While we stationed tens of thousands of troops in Germany to ostensibly protect it against Russia, Germany increases Germany's and Europe's dependence on Russian oil and natural gas. At the same time, we began to see the meteoric rise of the Chinese economy, due largely to US and Western adherence to World Trade Organization standards, while China, welcome to join the WTO, continue to flout them, to exploit them, and to grow its economy at an absolutely meteoric rate over the last 20 years, largely at the expense of, I don't know so much on the European side, but certainly the American middle class and our industrial base, much of which moved not only to Mexico in the 1990s, but in vast numbers to China in the noughts. And we now have a great power competition that has really come to the foreground with the rise to power of Xi Jinping as General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. And I think in closing this first question and answer period here, Anthony, I think one of the things that we in the West have forgotten or chosen to neglect or to minimize is that we're not simply dealing with China as a large market. It's certainly not a free economy. It's not a market capitalist economy. It's not a command economy either, as was the Soviet Union, but is certainly a state-directed economy, and one whose state-owned enterprises are used, one might say manipulated or ordered by Beijing, by the Chinese Communist Party authorities in order to attain certain national and international political, economic, and technological aims and goals. It's a rigid Leninist party in ways that most Americans don't understand. And I would say especially our corporate and financial elite, who still see China largely as a vast market to exploit. And this made sense when we thought that China was going to become a freer, more consensually governed country. And instead, the Chinese Communist Party pulled a fast one right before our eyes. And it's only really been about the last 5-6 years, I think, starting with the Obama administration, when President Obama realized that he was lied to his face by Chairman Xi on the militarization of the South China Sea and the artificial islands that China built out of nothing, out of corals and reefs and other oceanographic features, to militarize them and to threaten the international waterways through which 1/3 of the world's commerce traverses. So we're in great power competition now, mostly between the United States and China. Russia will play an important role here. And this has also opened the space for secondary powers such as Iran, in the Middle East especially, where it seeks to become a regional hegemon, and North Korea, which has no hegemonic ambitions, but I mean, realistically speaking, but certainly is able to play an incredibly important disruptor role in an area where 5 of the world's leading economies come together in terms of China, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and the United States as a Pacific power, all in East Asia. So we have a very, very different world environment today going into 2022 than probably we've seen in the last 30 years since the end of the Cold War. And certainly, I would say, Anthony, the most complex and dangerous global geopolitical landscape in the last 40 to 50 years.
Yeah, definitely. And you can say, you mentioned there, sort of the chairman of China. He's also, the past few months, we've seen what he's willing to do with the public companies in China, as well as he's almost trying to build the sort of cult of personality that we may have not, we probably haven't seen since Mao Zedong or even, Stalin in Russia. Sort of, do you see that as another threat where it's going almost, it's opened itself up to, free markets, and now it's almost going the opposite way?
Well, I don't know that it was ever moving in a free market direction. I think what the Chinese leaders before Xi has simply become much more open about the Chinese Communist Party's ultimate ambitions, which are really a matter of public record. We just, again, have chosen to ignore those pronouncements and those statements to our great detriment. But I think what you're seeing now is that under Xi, what's more important for the Chinese Communist Party is to maintain as absolute tight control over all aspects of Chinese society. You did see, relatively speaking, right, compared to what Mao Zedong, right, the most notorious murderer of the 20th century, beyond anything Stalin or Hitler committed in terms of sheer number of murder victims. But at the end of the Mao Zedong rule, when Deng Xiaoping opened up the Chinese economy, the idea was for China to start to become wealthy in a way that it simply could not under very rigid communist standards imposed by Mao. And there was a general sense of freeing up, and the privatization of Chinese wealth and the Chinese economy had somewhat liberalized over the decades, certainly not to Western standards, but certainly very much so compared to prior Chinese standards. Xi Jinping has moved much of that in a very backwards direction. It's regressed in many ways, where The private enterprises are paying the price for a much more state-controlled direction under Xi. State-owned enterprises have first dibs at access to capital in China, and they're also the ones that are directed by the Chinese Communist Party, not only for economic activity inside the country, but also under the Belt Road Initiative, the global infrastructure rubric through which the Chinese government, through state-owned enterprises, is able not only to offer credit to companies and to governments that are unable to access that type of credit on international markets, but then are beholden in a predatory lending fashion to Beijing, all of which is really part of the larger strategy, again, under Chairman Xi, to see to it that there is zero threat from his perception to absolute control over all aspects of Chinese society, the economy, the political system, the military system, under the rubric of the Chinese Communist Party. And it must remain absolute under Xi Jinping for as long as he will rule the country. And that may be for the next 15 to 20 years, depending on his health, given what he's done to the Chinese governing system.
Yeah, definitely. And as you said, they've brought in so many controls as small as, preventing children playing games for multiple hours. That's something that they've just recently brought in. But one thing you sort of mentioned before is that Russia, they pushed the boundaries with Georgia and obviously East Ukraine. There weren't many issues. They didn't really, as you said, there were sanctions, but nothing too much. We've seen there's the potential for Taiwan, seems it's at quite at risk. Do you sort of see what's happened in Afghanistan recently and how poorly that's been handled by obviously the US? Do you see that as a risk for Taiwan, where it could potentially, we know what they want. China have mentioned that they want to take over Taiwan. Do you see that as a potential risk in the next few years?
I don't know how much the Afghanistan withdrawal and its aftermath is really changing the calculus for a timetable in Beijing regarding the what it considers to be the eventual annexation of Taiwan into the People's Republic of China. Recall that Chairman Xi, I believe it was in January of 2019, at a People's Congress, publicly declared that Taiwan is going to be unified with China by 2049. And the reason that date is important is that marks the centennial of the establishment of the People's Republic of China under communist rule, right, in 1949, when they defeated the nationalists after World War II. So Taiwan has been informed by Xi Jinping that it is coming under communist rule sometime in the next 3 decades or so. But I don't know that that they're going to wait that long. They may see in Beijing a window of opportunity, given the US military power projection capability in the Western Pacific in relative decline, right? We've only been able to use one aircraft carrier in the Indo-Pacific in recent months, and that was delegated to the evacuation process out of Afghanistan. But I believe that what you're really seeing out of Beijing is not so much, and I could be wrong here, but not so much a strategy for a military invasion of Taiwan that would be extraordinarily painful to the Chinese economy and to China's society. They would ultimately prevail by every military calculation and model. But Taiwan is extraordinarily well fortified, and they are continuing to acquire defensive systems, missile systems that can strike deep into China and to attack cities deep inside of China. So it's not just a matter of a naval battle, but the Taiwanese government has made very clear, we will destroy as much of your economy, China, and kill as many of your citizens if you invade this island. I think the Chinese strategy more smartly would be one of attrition and intimidation, that Taiwan is inevitably going to come under Chinese control. So let's find a peaceful way now to negotiate this unification process. And that might have been something that could have been somewhat more effective 5, 10, 15 years ago. But I think between what the Chinese government has been doing to its Uyghur Muslim minority, putting them in concentration camps and essentially eliminating Uyghur culture in Western China, and especially what happened to Hong Kong in the last year to year and a half, where Hong Kong is sort of a mini model for what the Taiwan one country, two systems offer that China had made to Hong Kong when it acquired the city-state from the United Kingdom in the late 1990s, was a model that could have been somewhat attractive to Taiwan, not completely because it didn't want to come under communist control, but certainly as an alternative to a full-scale invasion. But the more we see that almost all democratic rights are disappearing in Hong Kong, the people of Taiwan may decide that it's better to fight to maintain their independence than to come under Chinese communist control. So this is going to be a very interesting process that I think will play out certainly over the next half decade to decade. And then the question becomes, and I can't read Xi Jinping's mind, but to what degree does he see himself as a leader on par with Mao Zedong? And he could accomplish that if he achieves the great Chinese dream, or the Han majority dream, of incorporating Taiwan into the People's Republic of China through whatever means, whether it's peaceful, whether it's negotiated, or whether it's one that ultimately involves military force. And the question is going to be, I think, for the United States and our Western partners, especially Japan, which, if one looks at the map, if Taiwan were to come into the control of the Chinese Communist Party, Japan would feel extraordinarily vulnerable, especially the southern archipelago of islands that hooks in a southwest direction from the main Japanese islands to just directly north of Taiwan. And when the Japanese economy is threatened by a Chinese military invasion, that means the South Korean economy is also threatened. And then you have tremendous global disruption by this kind of constant intimidation by a hostile and power projecting Chinese Communist Party that's absorbed Taiwan, absorbed its semiconductor industry. So it now is able to advance its technological goals, not only in China, but on a global scale, because technology really will lead the economy on a global scale throughout the 21st century, but then also be able to, if not absorb Japan and South Korea, those are wild fantasies, but to be able to render them neutralized or Finlandized, so to speak, and move them out of the US orbit and essentially isolate the United States and the West and the Western Pacific and relegate American influence to east of Hawaii.
Yeah, definitely. That's super interesting. And one thing I've sort of heard as well is I think it came up to the 100-year anniversary of the sort of Chinese Communist Party in general. So when that began, I think in the 1920s. So I know some people have sort of been putting that as a potential date, not for obviously invasion, but for, trying to achieve some of their goals as well.
Yeah, we just had those celebrations in Beijing several months ago, the establishment of the Chinese Communist Party. But it was under very different circumstances, I think, than what the Chinese leadership would have wanted pre-COVID. I think there were different aspects of celebration that they had intended. The country remains under lockdown in many ways. And I don't know how this will play out with the global economy over the next year to year and a half, but Chinese authorities have made relatively clear they intend to keep China largely closed to the outside world through the end of 2023.
Yeah, which is very interesting. So you sort of mentioned a few things there about their long-term political, economic, and military objectives. Can you sort of expand on those? And I know, one thing you mentioned there as well is the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a massive trade. I think it's across, lots of countries in the Middle East and Africa as well. So sort of what are they trying to achieve with all these long-term goals?
Well, I read the translations of Chinese Communist Party speeches and pronouncements. I don't know Mandarin, but I have the trusted authorities who know how to translate those as effectively as possible. And the Chinese have not been shy about this. They've openly declared their intention, for instance, to establish a world-class military that is a peer with the United States, again, by 2049, which means that China intends to be a global power projecting country with probably several aircraft carrier platforms to be able to move its fleet everywhere in the world, including right near us in the Western Hemisphere. There's also going to be a major space-based military where they'll be able to knock out US and Western satellite communications and effectively neutralize, if not defeat very quickly, the economy of the United States or Western Europe, potentially with electromagnetic pulses. And so they have very much declared openly their intention to establish a peer military with the United States in several decades. But until then, much of this march forward involves dominating technological standards. So there was one program called Made in China 2025, which was announced, I believe, in 2015, again, under Chairman Xi, where Beijing declared its intention to dominate or to attempt to dominate about 10 to 12 of the world's leading advanced breakthrough technologies, robotics, artificial intelligence, electric vehicles, biopharmaceuticals, agriculture, aerospace. But all of these leading technologies, the Chinese government has made a determined ploy to be able to dominate those as best as possible, again, through the wealth it's accumulated largely with American and European Western investment in the Chinese economy, and also through the control by Beijing of state-owned enterprises and directing financing through those state-owned enterprises into various technologies, and also, unfortunately, continued intellectual property theft, right? Forced technology transfers of any companies that are doing business, technology companies in China and the like. So we have Made in China 2025. That was followed several years later by China Standards 2035. And the goal there, again, openly proclaimed by Beijing, is to establish technological standards, norms, and platforms, just the way in many ways US-led innovation and technology has done so over the last 50, 60 years since the, in the post-World War II era, that China would be looking to do so to dominate technological standards for the remainder of this century. And what we're looking at probably, Anthony, is a bifurcated Internet of Things. One that may be US and Western dominated, another one that may be Chinese dominated, and then you have all of the many other countries in the world, scores of countries, that essentially will have to choose whether they want to live and operate and hopefully thrive in a US dominated technological network or a Chinese dominated technological network. So that's another very important direction that we're looking at that's of great concern. And then, of course, there's the financial component here, where unfortunately, because there is still great profit to be made investing in the Chinese market, those companies that are largely centered simply on profit making, especially in the financial sector, are continuing to invest, not only general investors' proceeds, but even that of pension funds. I remember speaking at one investment event in, I guess, right before COVID hit in January or February of 2020. And you actually had one of the major US defense contractors that was investing its employees' pension funds in the Chinese economy while they were selling weaponry to the United States government and our allies in the Pacific region in order to protect those countries from the Chinese military. So this is where we are today. And it's one that's going to be very difficult to disentangle from, because the economic integration of the United States and the global West with China is a completely different situation than anything that we faced during the Cold War, where the Soviet Union was largely isolated on a global economic scale. And so even as we look at ways to disengage critical aspects of the global Western economy from the Chinese economy, the linkages are so powerful and the profit motive is still so overwhelming, especially when it comes to industrial and manufacturing and processing, that this is going to take many years to unknot.
Yeah, definitely. I think we saw that after the COVID, supply chain issues, that it is so intertwined, even after the 2018 sort of US-China trade war, where some companies did move to other countries, but it's just so entwined. So as you said, it will take years. It's taken years to build, and it will take years to change and, move to other countries.
And the question will be, let's just talk about the US for a second. We don't tend to do industrial policy very well here. We tend to give as much leeway to the private sector under significant regulation, of course, as possible. But compared to other countries in what I would call the global West, we probably have one of the freest economies. And so industrial policy may be an important sort of strategy going forward in the years and decades ahead. I don't know that our political parties, as polarized as they are on so many other issues, domestic and foreign, are able to come together on industrial policy that literally has only the best interests of the American people at heart, as opposed to special interests that support different aspects, different segments of each political party. So I don't know that industrial policy will work. I think the question is going to be, how can American companies and European companies and those of our Western partners in Asia come together in a way where they recognize that there really is no choice but to advance Western principles, Western interests, and that there really is a danger to their own societies and to their own companies from this continued nearly blind integration with the Chinese economy. I don't know how we do that in an environment where so many of our corporate and financial elite have lesser ties to their respective nation states than to sort of a global class within which they operate, which includes their peers in China.
Yeah, definitely. And as you said, a lot of these people are sort of more rewarded more in the short term rather than long term. Whereas, you think of China 2049, the goals they have, it's basically just to dominate the world within the next 30 or 40 years. But yeah, sort of
Let me say one thing, Anthony. I don't know so much if it's a matter of dominating the world per se, in other words, as a global empire. But I think, first of all, and this is quite understandable, they see themselves historically as a regional hegemon, right? I mean, China has historically been a tributary power. All of these lesser societies and lesser peoples around the Han majority have paid tribute to this colossal economy that until the mid 1800s was the world's largest economy for probably 1,500 to 2,000 years. So there's a historical precedent here. The issue is not the economic strength and well-being of Chinese society. The problem is that there's a hostile Chinese Communist Party that intends to operate in a way that is completely inimical to how we in the West see the ideal universal civilization, especially since the Enlightenment. And so we have a different vision for how society should operate. And what China probably wants more than anything else is dominance in Asia. That seems quite clear, but then zero resistance for either replicating that model elsewhere around the world or not minding what other countries do around the world, as long as they continue to feed the prosperity that China seeks for its own economy.
Yeah, definitely. And as you said, that's sort of basically what the Belt and Road Initiative is, isn't it? Middle East, Africa, or all throughout Asia as well.
Well, it's actually a brilliant strategy. I don't know that it actually started out as a coherent one, as opposed to just a number of Chinese companies headed by executives who saw opportunities in markets that had been largely ignored by the West, especially in South Asia, in Central Asia, and as you correctly note, in Africa. And Africa is a colossal continent. Its population will likely double in the next 30 years. And there's tremendous economic and investment opportunity there, but it's an area that's been largely sort of shut out of at least American investment strategies. I think Europe takes a different approach because Europe also has a security component to its strategy in Africa, especially, and we'll talk about this later, I presume, the threat of tremendous migration flows overwhelming Europe in the decades ahead. But the Chinese have very smartly taken advantage of these opportunities. These African societies that have been unfortunately burdened by post-colonial corruption, sheikdoms, dictatorships, famine, underdevelopment, are now looking to exploit technology. And you have many African entrepreneurs who are able to use, for instance, their cell phones to be able to directly connect with the global economy, bypassing corrupt governments that have kept their people down over the years and over the decades. So the Chinese are also moving in to try to see where they can build factory floors in Africa. Given that Chinese wages are going up, they're going to have to find competitive wages elsewhere. They may as well own those factories in Africa that'll have competitive wages. But also, very importantly, Anthony, the extraordinarily valuable rare earth minerals that are to be found in mines throughout the African continent that really will be integral to all of the technologies and the products involved in electric vehicles and cell phones, in machine learning, and in the Internet of Things that, again, will dominate the global economy in the decades ahead. And the Chinese government, through its state-owned enterprises now, moving the private companies aside and having the state-owned enterprises coming in to many African economies, looking to see how they can dominate access to those rare earth minerals and ensure that they're processed in China so that China will continue to dominate that very important sector.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one thing as well is demographics. You look at China, it's got an aging population, sort of similar to other Western countries. Whereas I think Nigeria, just an example, Nigeria, I think half of their population is under 30 or under 20 potentially. So that's another benefit as well. They just have a very good demographics for growth. And, we see it in Vietnam and sort of other similar countries.
And they need to be able to provide jobs for all of these young men and women that have been born or will be born in the next 20 to 30 years. Again, there are certain African countries that pre-COVID were enjoying growth rates of 5, 7, 9% a year. Now, much of that has been stalled for now. I anticipate those will come back once we're able to address COVID as endemic rather than a pandemic, but that may take several more months or another year or two. But the population growth is something that, at least currently, the current trajectories seem overwhelming, and there'll be a faster population growth than job creation. And then the question for many of these African countries becomes, what do we do with this excess population that we, despite our tremendous job growth numbers, we cannot match the population growth? And that's going to be an existential issue for many African societies.
Yeah, we've seen the risk of having lots of unemployed people sort of in South Africa, especially young people in South Africa, where, you could say that's due to corruption and other matters, but there's been riots because, I think it's, high 30, 40, 50% of young people who are unemployed. And what else are they going to do?
And again, there's the good side of internet technology. There's the bad side of it. The bad side of it here is that you really can't hide information from people anymore the way you once could, say, up until 20 years or so ago. So all of these young people are able to open up their phones and see what kind of life they can find in other parts, probably not in Africa so much, but certainly in Europe or even in South Asia. And so they either want that for themselves, or where they can't get it, they'll start to migrate to those parts of the world. And I think migration is going to be one of the defining features of sort of the global economy in the next 10 to 30 years.
Definitely. We have seen sort of economic migration as well, really drastically increase over the past years that we will talk about later if we have time. So sort of onto we mentioned Afghanistan before. It is obviously the current matter in geopolitics. I think it's sort of just finished now. But sort of why did Afghanistan fall so quickly to the Taliban, and sort of what are risks that we will see from this fall sort of for Western countries around the world, or just countries around the world?
Well, there will likely be years and years of retrospection on what went wrong in Afghanistan. But I think if we just talk about certain fundamentals, as a matter of shortage of time here, Anthony, first of all, I think once we went into sort of a mission creep from going after Al-Qaeda and then punishing the Taliban for harboring Al-Qaeda for the most atrocious terrorist attack in modern history, right? The September 11th attacks on the United States. We moved into democracy promotion and nation building again, in what I said earlier was a culture that we barely understood and that really had no interest in Western values, norms, and institutions, right? I mean, given a very tribal society that has historically been loath to adhere to any centralized governance, we were going to look to implant that governing style in a country that had no interest in it. But I think what happened, looking back now, is that the military moved from a military mission, which was only partially accomplished, the routing of the Taliban, but the inability to go after and destroy Al-Qaeda. And of course, it took us 9 years to ultimately kill Osama bin Laden. But we went into a management of stalemate for the next 18, 20 years. And again, looking back, and I'm responsible here as well. I can't, cast a finger at others without assigning responsibility to myself. The Special Inspector General for the Afghanistan reconstruction was issuing annual reports since 2008, 2009, and highlighting everything that we were doing wrong in Afghanistan. And our political leaders didn't pay attention. Our military leaders were glad we weren't paying attention, because the generals that were offering a strategy that did not deliver victory continued to see enormous amounts of US taxpayer money being funneled to Afghanistan, and our media completely missed the story. They were lazy. They didn't think it was interesting. And so the American people were largely uninformed about this war that we supposedly were, winning just around the corner. And it turns out, instead of a single 20-year war that we didn't win, we fought 20 versions of a losing campaign or a stalemated campaign. So that's a lot of the background here that I think we're going to have to reassess if we ever engage in this type of military activity in the near future. But I think in terms of events of the last several months, I think probably the critical error looking back was the order in which the evacuation took place. By almost every dispassionate, objective military standard, the last thing you do is abandon the basis from which the military needs to operate freely to, first of all, evacuate all of your diplomats, all of your civilians, your expats, all of these NGO activists and employees that we sent into Afghanistan to do nation building and democracy promotion, and to secure the safety of our Afghan allies, the guards, the interpreters, all those who provided a safety cushion for our soldiers, for our diplomats, and who risked their lives for 20 years to help protect Americans. And may I add, very importantly, those of our NATO allies, because Afghanistan was a NATO mission. It wasn't a US mission, it was a US-led mission, but it was ultimately a NATO operation. That's one of the things that we'll have to work on after all of this, because many of our NATO allies are very upset with the White House's decision to withdraw the way that they did, with barely any consultation with our European allies. But the biggest mistake probably in the short term was closing down Bagram Air Base and doing it in the middle of the night, right? So we didn't even inform our Afghan partners, let alone our NATO allies, that we were abandoning Bagram. And I think that first reverberation, again, looking back, right, a lot of this is Monday morning quarterbacking, is that the Afghans realized that we were leaving, and we were leaving very fast, and we didn't seem very concerned about the well-being of our Afghan partners. And I think that demoralizing effect sort of opened their eyes to the realization that the Taliban, as they decided to progress towards Kabul, would likely be able to do so far more effectively than if the US had remained in Bagram and continued to provide the necessary air cover for the Afghan National Army to push back against Taliban forces and Taliban advances. So once that melted away, then the Afghan army, many of whom were very illiterate, never learned how to maintain very advanced equipment. Many of them, again, if you read the Inspector General's reports, were high, unreliable, not showing up on time for training sessions. And most of them, well, I shouldn't say most of them, that wouldn't be fair, because many of them lost their lives in the process, and we have to respect that sacrifice. But many of the Afghan soldiers did it largely for the paycheck. They were paid relatively well compared to other jobs in Afghanistan. So Bagram was the first colossal error. And then the idea that we didn't see the Taliban being able to move through Afghanistan as quickly as they did, when we had told everyone that August 31, we're withdrawing. And I can't recall from my military readings over the last 40 years, any time in military history where the one power informs the other power what date, months in advance, it's ending its military operations. So the Taliban knew in April and May that we were pulling out by August 31. And so they began to advance towards Kabul in order to be able to dominate the capital by that time. And with the Afghan army melting away, the Taliban essentially persuading Afghans that the US was withdrawing. Once they withdrew, NATO would withdraw as well, and that the country was going to become a Taliban-controlled government anyway. It all just faded away. And we were caught completely flat-footed. And I think it's very unfortunate, Anthony, that many of our leading diplomats and military officers were planning their nice, sleepy August vacations, which is the annual tradition here in Washington, D.C., the weekend right before, the Taliban moved into Kabul and stunned the world when they really shouldn't have found themselves stunned at all. So very, very unfortunate developments. And I think we'll be dealing with the aftermath of this for quite a number of years to come.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one thing that sort of surprised me was it was almost a trust that was put into Taliban. So, you say, I think there was at one point where they were outside Kabul city and one of the sort of diplomats in Qatar for the Taliban was saying, someone has to take control. It either has to be you or us, the US or Taliban's. And then I'm not sure if this is true or not. And then the US declined. And then obviously, giving the Taliban sort of the names of people who need to be evacuated. It seems there's a lot of trust put into, a potential enemy than we've ever seen before. Is that correct?
Well, it all depends on how accurate this is. And you raise a very important point. There's the fog of war in terms of actual military operations and what's happening on the ground, and it's seen in the air. And then there's the fog of war in the media. And, there are different agendas. There's a lot of finger pointing. So I don't know which of these are accurate. So I don't want to get into that in too granular a detailed level here, Anthony. But the bottom line is that where we are today, and this is irrefutable, is that we are having to engage the Taliban as the de facto sovereign government of Afghanistan, even though we've been dealing with them as a terrorist organization for the last 20 years. And as the White House press spokeswoman said after the fall of Kabul, the Taliban are in control. The Taliban are in control. She was very careful to not say that they're the sovereign government or the legitimate government, but she did acknowledge the Taliban are in control. And this is now who we're negotiating with. And what seems to be the case is that there have been these Americans that have been waiting on a number of planes to depart Kabul. And because of a lack of communication between the United States government and the Taliban government, they've been waiting in planes for days. And we have the potential here for a prolonged American hostage crisis in Afghanistan, and the White House tied down at the mercy of the Taliban, deciding which Americans to allow to leave Kabul, which Afghan allies, if any, to be allowed to leave Kabul or other parts of Afghanistan. And the prospect that we're going to be leaving behind, not Americans so much, that may take some time to get them all out, but certainly we're not going to get at all of the Afghan allies that the president promised would all be gotten out in time. And this could be a severe stain on American foreign policy, both here at home, domestically, politically, but also from the perspective of our allies and partners.
Yeah, definitely. And I think and this might be hearsay as well, but I think a lot of the, Afghanistan's, I'm not sure if it's the central bank's money or sort of foreign currencies are based in the US. So that could be something they're trying to, the Taliban might try to negotiate with to release those, US and sort of allies as well.
They could, but my sense is that once they start executing people, there'll be tremendous public pressure on Washington from the American people and from our European allies to begin to cave into those demands. And the Taliban, we know, are quite a ruthless organization. So I wouldn't put it past them to maximize their leverage. If they have Americans hostage or Afghan allies hostage or Europeans hostage in the country, that they wouldn't look to do whatever they needed to secure access to those billions of dollars in assets.
Yeah, definitely. And hopefully we hope that doesn't happen. But one thing that I think, obviously Joe Biden was elected last year, and I think a lot of people were hoping that he would change sort of Donald Trump's almost isolationist, for the US policies. Do you think that anything has changed since Joe Biden has been in? Is it maybe too short a time to compare, or how do you think it has changed?
Well, let me offer a different perspective, if I might, Anthony, because, I hear a lot about the so-called isolationism of the prior administration. And I don't know that that's necessarily the case across most of the issues of American foreign policy. It was a very pro-NATO strategy under President Trump. Now, did he operate and speak in very unorthodox ways about, for instance, NATO member commitments to military spending? Yes. But so did President Obama, who was very critical of a number of NATO countries, especially countries such as Germany, which are extraordinarily rich, have a tremendous trade surplus with the United States and with the European partners and fellow bloc members in the European Union. And yet we're spending at about 1% of GDP, while they were asking the United States to continue housing 35,000 troops in Germany to protect Germany against a Russian threat, while Germany doubles its energy reliance on Russia. So I think there were sort of exhortations that were quite different, but they weren't isolationist. We work with our Asian partners in trying to put together an effective North Korean strategy. We work with our Sunni allies in the Middle East to try to effectively constrain Iran's growth. So does one want to criticize Donald Trump for speaking in ways that were quite unlike that of his predecessors? Absolutely. And I think he'd welcome that criticism. But I don't see an isolationist strategy. And now going into the Biden administration, again, I don't see an isolation strategy on the part of the White House. You may have some blowback from our European allies who feel that the White House decision on the Afghanistan withdrawal was isolationist in effect, even if it wasn't intended that way. Although Secretary of State Blinken is very adamant that he's been consulting his counterparts in NATO countries during this entire process. But I think what you're seeing here from President Biden is an emphasis on alliance building where possible. But I think what's more important here than what's coming out of the White House is what's coming out of the American people. And I don't know that I would call the American people isolationist, but I think what we have seen over the last 20 years is a weariness with military engagement without clear goals. The American people are not war weary, I would posit, Anthony. They're tired of not winning campaigns that we dispatch our military to conduct and execute effectively. with victory as the goal. And so when you have a prolonged insurgency in Iraq, when you have a 20-year NGO, a military NGO operation in Afghanistan, effectively, the American people say, we've sacrificed thousands of the lives of our young men and women. We've spent trillions of tax dollars looking to rebuild these countries and to provide for greater security for the United States, but we don't seem to have achieved those goals. And I think that's where you have weariness with the inability of our political and military leaders to deliver on aims and objectives to the American people in a way that is satisfactory.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one thing you mentioned there was obviously the media and I guess how they, how they represent sort of Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. But are there any other sources? I know you obviously have your internal sources, but are there any sort of available sources that you use, particularly for sort of geopolitical news or anything like that you trust?
Well, I'm very fortunate that I live and work in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan region. And so we're able to work here with U.S. government officials in the executive branch, lawmakers, and very, very well-informed staff in the Senate and the House of Representatives. We're in the middle of one of the most robust think tank communities, if not the most in the world here, with literally dozens, if not hundreds, of think tanks and policy institutes with some of the finest minds anywhere in the world, analyzing all of these issues on a global scale 24/7. And so we have many of those extraordinarily well-informed sources who are operating in real time with all of these issues, dealing with crisis management, dealing with long-term planning and the like. And so I'm very fortunate to enjoy those relationships. And I've also been able to develop, I would say, an instinctive feeling based on experience, based on accumulated wisdom of those thinkers that are most original, that are most refreshing, and that are willing to defy conventional wisdom and look to see where trends and developments are actually taking us, as opposed to what conventional wisdom and your day-to-day pundits will tell us is the case, most of whom are largely uninformed about the international issues which they're brought on board to discuss.
Yeah, definitely. I guess you could say that's a problem with politics across the world, that there's so many things that they need to know and they don't know a lot about most of them. But sort of looking at any other risks that you see, we've talked about China, we've talked about Russia. Are there any other sort of geopolitical risks that you're watching or you think other people should be watching that could potentially, affect all of us over the next few years?
Very much so. No, we're in a state of constant flux. And I think, again, in an environment of great power competition, we're going to see our adversaries and rivals seeking to exploit any areas of vulnerability or weakness they detect on the part of the United States. So let's put China and Russia aside for now, although I think their malign activities will flourish and will probably grow in the years to come. You look at a country such as Iran, which is seeking to become a regional hegemon and establish for itself power projection capability that reaches to the eastern shores of the Mediterranean Sea through northern Iraq and Syria, and then south of the Arabian Peninsula to Yemen and to the mouth of the Red Sea, where the Bab al-Mandab choke point connects the Indian Ocean to the Red Sea and to the Mediterranean Sea. So any power that is able to control those choke points is able to thwart sea lanes of communication, global shipping, energy supplies to Europe. And so Iran is looking to establish itself as the regional hegemon, especially if it is able to acquire a nuclear weapons capability. And again, it's unfortunate that the Iranian people are suffering because of the delusional theological aims and goals of the mullahs in Tehran, that you have this vibrant, thriving, and essentially pro-Western society in Iran, and they're held captive for the last 40 years by this theocracy that is acting in very hostile ways, not only against its Sunni neighbors, but obviously against Israel. And in what other part of the world do we tolerate a government that openly declares its intention to annihilate another nation state? And so Iran has been able to get away with this because countries such as China and Russia are looking to build up and support any country that poses these types of problems or geopolitical distractions for the United States. And unfortunately, here's an area of great divide between the United States and many of our European allies. Countries in Europe are looking to conduct greater business ties with Iran, while we're looking to see how we can better constrain Tehran and persuade it to become a normal country in the Middle East, operating peacefully and ideally prosperously with all of its neighbors, whether they're Sunni, whether they're Jewish. But that's going to be a problem for some time to come, I believe. And when Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei passes away, he's now 80, 81 years old, and he's been in frail health for quite some time. We don't know to what extent there's going to be a relatively secure, smooth transition of power in Iran, especially when there's been a great restive population in its Arab minority and with its Azeri minority. So we'll see what happens in Iran in the years to come. I would also say North Korea. I think you're going to see a resumption of nuclear testing in North Korea, and that's going to sort of concern our allies, South Korea and Japan. And the more that Japan especially feels that the United States security umbrella is weakening or diminishing because of what happened in Afghanistan, because of what may happen in Taiwan, then Japan may decide to further militarize its forces, which are now purely defensive. They have been since the end of World War II, and potentially even seek to acquire nuclear weapons as a matter of self-defense against China. And then the issue would be, what would China do to destroy any nuclear capability in Japan before those could be deployed? Now, this is many years out, but this is potentially the direction that we see the area going, and especially if North Korea continues to be the wedge issue that China uses against the United States and our global Western allies in the Western Pacific region. And then I would just say also, probably as we alluded to earlier, Anthony, migration. Migration is potentially going to become a major issue for the European Union literally in the next 1 to 2 months, depending on what kind of outflow of migrants and refugees we see from Afghanistan through Iran towards Turkey and towards Greece. So Turkey is completing a 500-kilometer wall. It's about 9 feet tall, right, 3 meters tall, along its border with Iran. And the wall was originally designed to keep out Iranian Kurds that were looking to destabilize southeastern Turkey. Now it's being built out to prevent Afghan refugees from coming into Turkey. And then Greece completed, I believe it's a 40 to 50-kilometer wall along its Evros River border with Turkey. And the European Union, I believe today, is far less tolerant of migrants and refugees than it was in 2015, when Chancellor Merkel unilaterally declared that Germany would be open to migrants and refugees from Syria, from Iraq, from Afghanistan, even from Sri Lanka. And this caused tremendous political chaos inside the European Union. And we began to see so-called solidarity in the EU fray over EU countries inside of the Schengen agreement beginning to erect walls to protect their national sovereignty and territory against these uncontrolled migrant flows. So this is the short-term prognosis for Europe. But as we also spoke about earlier, if you do have this kind of unchecked population growth continuing in many African countries, while the economy grows, the population will grow faster than the economies in many African countries. And many of these African entrepreneurs will start to see that there's opportunity if they can get to the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. Egypt, probably not so much. That's a tightly run country. But Libya especially, as long as the civil war continues and it's a largely ungoverned, massive state, you'll see large migrant flows through human trafficking pipelines to the Mediterranean Sea, potentially with hundreds of thousands of migrants coming in annually to Europe, and no coherent European Union strategy to deal with that potential migrant flow in the decade ahead.
So, John, thank you so much for joining the What the Finance podcast today. On to my last question. Sort of, what is one message you'd like listeners to take away from our interview?
Well, first of all, Anthony, thank you very much again for having me and sharing this platform with me. And I hope this has been informative and enlightening for your audience. I don't know that there's a single takeaway here. I would say that, as I mentioned at the outset, we are entering the most complex and dangerous global geopolitical landscape in decades. The world in many ways may become more dangerous. And maybe the supreme takeaway here is not so much that we're going to see a US-China great power competition, but that really we're seeing the world itself, the global economy, being split. One that would be more US, European, global Western standard led, and another one coming under increasing Chinese orbit, especially in Southeast Asia, because of geopolitical realities. They're simply smaller, weaker countries under a historic Chinese regional hegemon in Asia, but especially many countries in Africa and potentially even in Latin America that come under Chinese investment sway, build into Chinese technological platforms, norms, and standards. And we see potentially a bifurcated global economy playing out in as little as the next 5 to 10 years. And I think that's going to be the key strategic issue going into the middle of the 21st century.
Perfect, John. Thank you so much. So if anyone wanted to get in contact with you or learn, listen to more of your work or learn more about you, where would the best place for that be?
My YouTube channel, just look up John Sitilides on YouTube and you'll see several hundred of my interviews. I have several of my speaking engagements there on global geopolitical risk, and also a number of publications. And my website is simply my last name, Sitilides.com.
All right, perfect. I'll put that all in the description below so everyone can find that. John, thanks again.
And they can follow me on Twitter at John Sitilides.
John Sitilides, perfect. Thanks again. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Anthony.